Hi, my name is Professor John Romano, and I'm recording this lecture, Normans on the Horizon, for my course, Medieval England. This lecture will cover the period, especially in political history, from right around the year 978 to 1066. And that year 1066 ought to be familiar to you, even if you haven't studied medieval England before. This is normally seen as one of the great turning points in medieval English history. When last we left off speaking about the political history of England in this period, we said that King Edgar had recently died, and this death ends up causing a succession crisis. The person who was waiting in the wings to take over upon Edgar's death is his son, Edward, shown here in this coin. Edward sometimes referred to as the Martyr, for reasons we'll talk about in a moment. Edward was a teenager upon coming to power, and was seen as the candidate of the monastic party, those who really were close to the church and advocated reform within it. Those who did not necessarily want the monks to have too much power were against this monastic party. Decided that they would use the younger son of Edgar, known as Aethelred, as kind of a figurehead. We don't really think Aethelred had much part in being close to some of these nobles, but he was tarred by some of their actions. Some of these noblemen who really wanted at all costs to curtail the liberties of monks, the liberties of the church, and along the way also to try to grasp the land of the church. Here's another image of Edward, as you can see, actually with an arrow going through his heart, for reasons we'll talk about in a moment. Among some nobles, the reform represented by Edward was very unpopular. The church was trying to advocate rules, for instance, about matrimony that were not universally accepted. So, for instance, that one had to have a certain degree of separation from one's spouse, and if that were not the case, the children could potentially be declared illegitimate. It also seems that Edward endeared himself to no one, in that he was young and he had a quick temper upon coming to power. We really don't end up seeing much of a reign for Edward. He was not in power for all that long, and it seems that his brief reign ended then in murder. This is a modern image, supposedly, in which Edward is going out for his last ride. Oddly enough, no one seems to have been punished for this murder. After this point, a very obscure cult grows up around Edward, considering him somehow to be a martyr. And it really is very unclear exactly who wanted him dead. It's possible that some of those people who were advocating for Aethelred in the first place had also decided to end Edward's reign early. What seems to be indisputable at this point is Edward's half-brother Aethelred would take over. And Aethelred ends up having one of the longest reigns in English history, especially particularly long reign for the medieval period, but it's a reign that is one of almost unremitting disaster. In fact, there's all sorts of folk memories circulating about how bad it was. Here's another coin here of Aethelred. Modern historians have to some degree rehabilitated his reputation, if only to point out that some of the circumstances in which he became king would have been difficult for anybody. But really they've only partially succeeded in this effort at making his reign seem palatable. Here's yet another coin of Aethelred. The nickname that Aethelred is stuck with is the Unready, which is actually a nickname that was a pun on his given name Aethelred, the Old English Unreid, which means the ill-advised. We think that at least part of the problems of Aethelred lay in some of the problems that he inherited, and really would have been difficult for any king, especially the kind of Danish invaders who begin to attack England during this period. And here's one of the charters of Aethelred. We understand most of his reign through the lens of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which really is unremittingly negative also in its depiction of Aethelred, and this certainly has had some sort of effect on how historians tend to view him as well. At least some of his contemporaries were highly unimpressed with him. In any case, the Danish Viking invaders who came to England during his reign were something of a new creature. Elsewhere, the great Viking attacks of the past had largely been contained in Western Europe, and really these new Viking raids are not just bands, small bands of Vikings striking out on their own. We see in effect the Danish monarchy, which had itself grown considerably in strength, actually organizing a much larger scale expedition to attack England. The Viking raids initially began early as when Aethelred took power. Initially speaking, they didn't have much of an impact, and it did appear that Aethelred confronted them with energy and ability at first. Things change, however, at the Battle of Maldon, in which one of his nobles ends up suffering a terrible defeat. This is approximately where in England Maldon is. This is where the battlefield looks like today. The interesting part about the Battle of Maldon, shown here in a much later medieval manuscript, was that the Vikings actually were allowed to land. And they did one of the rare things of medieval battles, which is that the two sides fought a pitched battle, which is generally avoided in medieval warfare. The problem for Aethelred's perspective is that the English lost this battle. The rationale for actually entering into battle makes sense. That in effect we do think that the English decided that it was better to actually confront the Vikings head on rather than seemingly allow them to sack at will. But the very destructive kind of impact of this battle meant that this was perhaps a bad calculation. In any case, most people would say the Battle of Maldon was the turning point of Aethelred's reign, and really it represents something of a humiliation for the English, inasmuch as now the English had to pay tribute to the Vikings. And as we've seen before, once Vikings begin to take tribute money, their demands go up and up. And so, in fact, the Vikings end up getting so much money from England that it convinced them that this was a land worth taking over entirely. And in fact, some people would say that it would take actually a full 20 years to fully recover from these kind of circumstances, including two 11th century conquests of England we'll speak about more in a moment. This problem would have been bad enough just for external forces bearing in on England. We do think, though, that this battle had and some of the political difficulties previously had laid bare some division among the English nobility. And so, in fact, not everyone necessarily is on Aethelred's side, and these kind of defections mean that the English are not fighting as a united front. The most powerful of the opponents from the Danish side is King Sweyn, shown here. We do think that King Sweyn wore down the English defenses. In fact, at one point, the English royal family had to go into exile in northwestern France, in Normandy. After King Sweyn died, he ended up being succeeded by the person shown here in this coin. This is his son Canute. Canute, although he takes over the position of the King of England, also can never really afford completely to focus all his attention on it. And actually has to, because of political difficulties in Denmark, he does actually have to quickly return there to reclaim his throne there. Here is, again, another image of Canute. Here's actually an image of Canute from Denmark. Actually, not this stone mentions the name Canute, not an image of actually his face. We really see Canute begins to clear house quite quickly upon returning to England. His last major opponent was the son of Aethelred, Edmund, known as Ironside, shown here, very clearly losing the battle to Canute, who's shown here on the right. We see, in fact, at this major battle at Ashington, both sides suffer heavy casualties, we see after this battle is over, there's at least some attempt by Canute to somehow compromise with Edmund, who had survived the battle, Edmund very soon would die, which removed the problem entirely from the perspective of Canute. At this point, Canute ends up actually marrying Ethelred's former wife, Emma, in order to legitimize himself. Oddly enough, he doesn't feel the need to divorce the other woman that he was married to at the same time. He just disregards that church rule entirely. Here's another image of Canute, another coin of Canute. We do think that Canute couldn't help but be better than Aethelred was in his position as king. If nothing else, Canute had actually managed to reestablish peace. You shouldn't think, though, that Canute wanted to get rid of everything that had made Aethelred's time as king even moderately successful. And in particular, I'm thinking of the kind of English administration that we said was already well in place. In effect, things like collecting taxes continues to be done seamlessly, even though they had passed over to a new ruler. We do see Canute as well, very interestingly, becoming interested in some of new kind of legislation, in essence, to make the English behave better in his eyes. And none of this means that we think that Canute really is going to uproot things completely upon coming to power. We do see, for instance, English bishops remain unchanged. Again, here's some of the ecclesiastical institutions of the time. Still very much the same kind of bishops and abbots are allowed to remain in power. Again, native people. Abbots continue to be extremely powerful. Monasteries continue to be intellectual centers. If anything, in fact, we really see this continued concern with reading and writing Latin in a routine capacity may actually become even better at writing Latin during this period. Here are just some of the manuscripts from under the time of Canute, again still making these sort of very lavish manuscripts, like we saw, for instance, with the Lindisfarne Gospels. And again, here's an image of the crucifixion with Emma down below, hugging the wood of the cross. We tend to think that one of the very interesting things about Canute's reign is that when he came into power, the Kingdom of England becomes a different kind of creature. They really raised the possibility now of incorporating England as part of this kind of vast northern empire, which would involve England, but also would involve Denmark, and for a period of time, even Norway. This, of course, would mean that combined, one would think that the resources of this kingdom would be vast. The real problem, though, that Canute finds is that really his attention is always somewhere else. He never focus entirely upon England. He has to, for instance, absent himself from England on a regular basis to engage in battles elsewhere. We do see that Canute also brings over some of his own nobility to England, in part because of some of these battles that he engaged in had meant that some of the native nobility had died. Others Canute had purged because he didn't think that they were loyal enough, especially those who really had been opposed to his attempt to gain the throne. Just to give you some idea, this is actually one of the most famous images of Canute's time as king. You can see Canute Rex, king. Of course, he is here with the cross with his queen, and up above, of course, the person who has given him these powers, Jesus. We think as Canute stays in power in England, he begins to find ways to delegate local authority because he knows that he is not going to be present in England at all times. One of the major things he does, for instance, is to put the whole of Wessex under a single earl known as Godwine. And this was in part, this is a logical response to the fact that Canute really was a stranger in this region, so it seemed to make sense initially to put this area in the hands of a trusted follower. Godwine's father had actually allied himself with the Danes when other English did not, this was the reason why Godwine was rewarded so handsomely. This is interesting too because Godwine's family really did not have aristocratic roots. It really was this personal sort of situation where his father had been loyal to the Danes. That meant that Godwine ends up getting paid off in essence. We do see that although he did realize that at first Godwine had would actually end up becoming something of a monster. Really, Godwine would give his sons some of the most important positions in England, especially with Canute's absence. Godwine really ends up getting an independent power base. Again, this is really particularly a problem when he has to go abroad to be able to fight in Scandinavia. And really, most people would say that right around the end of Canute's reign until 1066, time for anywhere from around 30 years, there ends up being a crisis in English politics, in part created by this whole question of Godwine and his power. One of the main difficulties that Canute experiences during this period is Norway stages a successful revolt against Denmark as their Danish masters. We think initially it had been Canute really had wanted of his children to allow his oldest son, Harthacnut, to succeed him as King of England and Denmark united. But we really see that Harthacnut cannot leave Denmark, which is unstable at the time, in order to come over and to claim the English throne. With all this indecision upon who would succeed Canute, the nobles in England begin to rally around either Harthacnut or his half-brother, shown here, Harold Harefoot. His mother was the other wife of Canute. And eventually we see most English nobles end up opting for Harold Harefoot, shown here in this coin, also shown here. At the same time, and again, this of course is also all due to this political situation swirling around Canute, Godwine still had control over much of southern England, and in fact some of the richest areas of England. But at least for a period of time, he decides to support Harold Harefoot. Yet nothing, of course, can ever be simple. And before Harold Harefoot is elevated, there's a challenge by another of Emma's sons with Aethelred, Alfred. And Harold Harefoot's party, which was led now by Godwine, ends up capturing Alfred and blinding him, and which would make him, in their eyes, incapable of ruling, and Alfred died soon afterwards. This was something that really permanently cast a sort of a sinister shade on Godwine, that he was capable of this kind of thing. At this point, with no further impediment, Harold Harefoot gained the throne with the support of all the major nobles in England. Very little is known about Harold Harefoot's reign. He died very soon from natural causes after having been ill. And Harthacnut, in all this situation, finally ends up hashing out a settlement with the King of Norway. He made this very interesting kind of arrangements that both he and the King of Norway, each of them could be one another's successor if they died without any male issue. And once Harold Harefoot died, Harthacnut decided to come to England. He was generally accepted by the nobility. We do not think he was very well liked. The political crisis continues. Harthacnut, after a relatively brief reign, drops dead promptly. Rumors of poisoning circulate around, but no proof is produced of said poisoning. It's at this point that the successor, this is Edward, comes to the fore. Edward was another of Emma's sons, again by Aethelred, but really in some ways he was a very curious choice. He was a bachelor king, entering his middle age upon taking power. He was absolutely penniless, and he had no military reputation to speak of. Many people think that the only reason he came into this kind of power had less to do with his personal qualities and more to do with the fact that there was virtually no other alternative at the time. Here again is Edward, sometimes referred to as Edward the Confessor, for reasons we'll speak about in a moment. As Edward takes charge, it's very clear that there continues to be danger from Scandinavian. In fact, the King of Norway, shown here in a modern image, known as Magnus, this is he says, in fact, that he still has a claim on England due to that treaty that he had previously made with Harthacnut. We also see that he at least has. We do see, though, that Edward also, in addition to these sort of dangers from the outside, he also has some allies. We do think that at least people from Normandy are showing him goodwill. He had actually been brought up there, and we also see too that he is well enmeshed in the sequence of power there very quickly. A lot of the beginning of his reign is under the thumb of Godwine, who's still around. And in fact, among other things, Edward is actually forced to marry Godwine's daughter, shown here, named Edith. Later on, though, when Godwine loses much of his power, he simply sends her packing to a convent, dissolving the marriage. Gradually speaking, one of the most interesting developments during Edward's reign is that their ties are growing closer to Normandy. Again, this area of northwestern France that initially had been founded by Vikings. And this is shown very clearly when someone from a Norman background, known as Robert, he had actually once been the abbot of a Norman abbey, like this one. He actually will first become Bishop of London, and then ends up becoming appointed to be the new Bishop of Canterbury. This is controversial in England because Godwine had actually wanted a monk from Canterbury to assume the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, which had appeared that Edward would block. Edward travels to Rome to be able to collect the pallium, that sort of woolen stole we talked about, that was the symbol of his power of being the archbishop. Along the route to Rome, he decides to stop at Normandy and speak to William, pictured here in a coin, William of Normandy, sometimes referred to rudely later on as William the Bastard. It seems that Robert ends up promising him the succession. This was not a totally illogical plan, really. Edward, of course, had no son waiting. We really see that William was renowned as a warrior. It was thought that he could actually keep the Norwegians out of England if he were to gain the power of the throne. And in fact, at least some English nobles appear to have been very happy with the idea of William assuming the position of King of England. But clearly not all of them. Godwine, perhaps beginning to recognize his hold on power is slipping, started to form allies of his own. In fact, among other things, his first son, Tostig, married the half-sister of the Count of Flanders, located in modern-day Belgium. Tostig's name is actually right around this sundial here. When the nobles opposed to Godwine, we see that Godwine decides that he has to flee England entirely. He leaves for Flanders to seek protection for himself. In the following year, Godwine, with the aid of the Flemish, will return to England, and in fact, at least some of those in Wessex, like certain seamen there, would support him. And Godwine, through military means, then would seize control over southern England. Among other things, as a sign now of his renewed power, we see that Godwine would end up sending Robert, the Archbishop, packing and installing his own man in his place as Archbishop of Canterbury. All of this really begins to bode very badly for England. In fact, it looked now that the sides were beginning to line up for a civil war. We do see at least some of the great men of England were anxious to avoid this kind of civil war at all costs. If only, I should say, to avoid a foreign invasion. If not also, of course, to avoid the destruction of their lands, which inevitably happens when you begin to have large armies and attacking one another. In any case, soon after he had been restored to power, restored to England, Godwine would end up dying. Really, in his power, he was succeeded by his son, shown here in this coin, Harold II. We think that Harold II decides, really quite cleverly in some sense, that It was very bad politics to go after the old King Edward while he was still alive. He allowed Edward to continue his reign, allowed Edward to engage in his pastimes like hunting, and in fact, in his free time, we think that Harold begins, Harold II, as he's known, actually begins to try to unsuccessfully to gain an alliance with some of the nobles in France. It does appear, although this is extremely hazy as well, that Harold does at some point seem to recognize William of Normandy as his heir. That is a little bit unclear and certainly contested by all parties. In any case, when Edward finally passes away, whatever Harold had originally said, Harold decides that he really feels that he is the legitimate heir. He is the one who should be taking over the position of kingship. And in fact, he even begins to claim that in his last hours, Edward had actually given him the position of king. It is always very convenient to to pass on some message of someone who's just about to die, because no one can really contest it. At this point, it was obvious to everyone that whether or not Harold II would remain king would be decided only by battle. Really, this is the time period in which we see William, the Duke of Normandy, is very clearly, he feels that the position of king is rightfully his. He's going to press his claim. What really gets even more complicated is that the King of Norway still feels that the position of King of England is his to take as well. This King of Norway is, believe it or not, is yet another Harold. This is Harald Hardrada. Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, had gained a reputation for being a fantastic general, we see in effect that he decides that he is going to press his claim by war as well on England. And we see that Harald Hardrada decides to form an alliance with Harold II's estranged brother Tostig. Really Tostig felt that his own brother had betrayed him, that he had given him no political power, so in fact he decides to throw his hat in with the Norwegians in the hope that when the Norwegians came to power, he would be able to benefit. It's at this point that one of the great events of English history, the Norman Conquest, takes place. Again, to give you some idea of where we're talking about, the Battle of Hastings was fought down here, one of the reasons why it is so difficult for Harold II to be able to respond and go to this battle is because the first battle he fights against the Norwegians is up here, much further in the north at Stamford Bridge, which I'll talk about more in a moment. We think that William, in some ways, William, of course later known as the Conqueror, has all the luck in this conquest. He has an area that is very well organized, it is wealthy, and he had in essence decided that he would allow adventurers from all over Western Europe, anyone who wanted money, who wanted to make a name for himself, to come ally themselves with him and go take England. We also see, too, that William was smart enough to first gain papal support before he actually attacked. At least part of the reason is that this whole question about the fact that this archbishop had been unfairly taken out of power. Also, too, William claimed that he was going to be part of the Reform Party, that, for instance, he was going to make sure the English followed proper rules having to do with matrimony, which again had been a contested matter in previous times. For a good period of time in Normandy, William could not actually manage to leave. He had to wait for winds to blow in the appropriate direction. And he manages to keep this army relatively cohesive and peaceful until, of course, they make it to England, and they're expected to go to battle immediately. While all of this is happening in the south, we see that Harold Hardrada, shown here, and the Norwegians would travel to the north of England, where they would engage in battle with Harold II at Stamford Bridge. In effect, it's at this point that this battle is really, we think, fairly disastrous altogether for the Norwegian side. Harold Hardrada and Tostig are both killed, this is really what ends up completely removing the Norwegian threat. The big problem that Harold II faces, though, is that he has moved very quickly to respond to this Norwegian invasion, almost as soon as he's finished with this battle, he has to immediately turn around with this army and go to the south to face William, who in the meantime had landed and was ready to fight. Again, William had sailed from Normandy over, and again, eventually the battle is going to take place here at Hastings. Here's where the battlefield looks like in the modern period. From what we can reconstruct, it appears that the English form an impenetrable wall of shields, but they didn't have cavalry, they didn't have archers, whereas Normans had cavalry, infantry, and archers. On top of all those other advantages, we do think that the Normans, the Norman army, was much better rested than the English. They were ready, whereas we think the English army now was exhausted after having already fought another battle. In terms of reconstructing the battle, it is possible that the Normans ended up breaking through the shield wall of the English by feigning a retreat, then turning around and heading straight at them. We do think the Battle of Hastings was an all-day battle. It was a battle, of course, in which William ends up being victorious, and at the end, of course, Harold is dead. Harold II is dead. This is an inscription put up at a spot where the battle took place. Along, you can see in the background, Battle Abbey, which is an abbey that William ends up having put up as a result of a vow before he took the battle, that if he was successful, he would erect this monastery. The result of this famous battle, the Battle of Hastings, was, of course, Harold II was dead. Virtually all adult members of his family were dead as well. In addition, many of the major native English nobles had died in this cause as well. Those hadn't died at Hastings. Some of them had actually died previously in the battle in the north at Stamford Bridge. So altogether, it appeared that the Norman victory was complete and it was decisive. What really capped all of this off was, of course, on Christmas Day, much as Charlemagne had once been crowned on, in the year 1066. William the Conqueror would now be crowned King of England. We'll spell out soon just how different William's kingship was. This represents, of course, a major shift in leadership for England in the medieval period. All right. Thank you for listening.